The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. On today's show, I have Oliver Zugel. Oliver is CEO and founder of Foliumed, who are a producer of pharma-grade cannabis with bases in Colombia and Germany. Oliver, how are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me on your show, Anuj.
No, pleasure. Welcome. So there's a few topics we're going to talk about. Probably the main one is going to be around standardisation, which is an important topic that's sort of come up a few times in recent weeks on the show. But as is always traditional, why don't we find out a bit more about you? How and why did you get into the industry, and tell us a bit about Foliumed?
Well, I created my first cannabis venture in 2016 in the United States, in Las Vegas, precisely when it was medical market, then became recreational. It was an extract-based company. And I came into the industry as so many of us. Now, I had a friend who was having terminal cancer, and had told me about his experiences of how difficult it was for him to find medical cannabis in the European market, in Germany in particular, which is where I'm from and where he was based. And he passed away about 6 months after we started to have the conversation. And it just became very apparent to me at that point in time. He had been using flowers at that point to help him with his pain, that the potential of the cannabis to resolve some of these, I think, very profound issues, whether it's mental health or pain or cancer, was pretty fundamental. And so I came across pretty much at that point in time with a very talented entrepreneur in Nevada. We set up together our first cannabis company. And in 2018, I decided to create the second cannabis company, which is Foliumed, which is entirely medical. It's not in the adult use sector. And fortunately, I had the ability to bring over some of the experiences from a medical market, having turned adult use into what is a purely medical and pharmaceutical orientation by now.
Brilliant. That's quite good in Vegas, of all places, to start off. And so why don't you tell us a bit more about what Foliumed does then?
Yeah, well, we are a low-cost producer of THC and CBD ingredients. That's what we're doing in Colombia. We have a relatively small footprint cultivation where we're operating under GCP, good agriculture and collection practices. Then for markets which are not operating under EU-GMP, we are selling directly out of Colombia, so that's Latin America, Australia at large, the health and wellness markets in the UK. And for EU-GMP markets, so pharmaceutical grade, Germany, Australia, as well at a bit of a lower level, that all goes through the German facility where we partnered up with a German pharmaceutical company, which is narcotics licensed and EU-GMP certified. And fundamentally from that facility do come pharmacy kits, compounding in the pharmacies, as well as soft gel capsules. So more manufactured and finished medical products.
Right, great. And so it's amazing that you've got sort of a global market for your products.
Well, medical markets today, right outside of North America, where the interpretation of medical is very different from what we're seeing here in Europe and Australia. I think that those markets are often very surprised that people vastly overestimate the current size of the medical market outside of North America. So, and I always give one little anecdote, which means that we're currently just cultivating on a hectare approximately on our site. I can produce the entire demand for Germany on that 1 hectare. And I think in terms of grow capacity worldwide for medical cannabis going to Germany, what have we got? Well, probably 1,000 hectares or something like this. So markets are small, which means that if you want to build a business, I think you need to be able to address markets with different regulatory frameworks around the world, all of them pretty early stage. Therefore, I think the volumes you move, you cannot make them just going to a single place. So this is why we're touching Latin America, Australia, and Germany first and foremost.
Right. That's sort of brought up a few more questions. So who actually, I mean, and presumably the North American medical market is the biggest?
Yes, and here, as probably most of your audience know, the definition of a North American medical market is very different from what you would be seeing on the European continent or even in Australia, just in terms of the quality requirements, how the product is prescribed. It's actually recommended, not prescribed in North America. And of course, that market at this point in time, what is probably 50 times the size of anything else which is out there. But it is a not pharmaceutical market in some form. And that line is very fine, right? I mean, between what is medical and where it starts becoming pharmaceutical. The Europeans, I think ultimately the Asians, the Australians, they all will take an approach to this where it's a prescription product as for starters. And therefore, any type of prescription product is, of course, ultra regulated and follows the medical and pharmaceutical guidelines. And that's very different from what the North American philosophy is, which is not worse, not different. It just comes from a different angle. It says it's a health and wellness product. It's a mental, it's also for mental health issues. And therefore, it doesn't need to comply with GMP pharmaceutical manufacturing practices. And so it's just a different way of getting it. It's much more widely available, of course, in North America than what we see over here. Doesn't require prescription. So that's, I think, in my mind, the differences we're looking at here.
Yeah, I mean, from my understandings of EU-GMP and the similar sort of regulations, they're very onerous, aren't they, on the producer or the seller? Whereas from what you're describing there's less of those sort of very stringent requirements in North America.
Yeah, it's interesting, Anush. If you look at the majority of the participants of where they're coming from when they got into industry, I think colleagues of mine, founders, leaders in North America, I would think that probably less than 10% of them come originally from a pharmaceutical background. I include myself. I'm not a pharmaceutical guy. This is why we teamed up with a pharmaceutical company in Germany. And if you're not coming from the pharmaceutical side of things, it is very hard to understand what this GMP three-letter word actually means. And some people believe it's just about money and you build a big facility and it's EU-GMP, but it is unfortunately, or fortunately for the patient, I think it's much more complicated. It's ultimately a quality management system, which just needs to look at every possible thing which could go wrong and has backup systems for everything and is extremely well documented. And that's not the standard at which North America is operating. Over time, they may be there as well, but I think for the time being, it's the Europeans and Australians who are setting the quality levels for the type of use we're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good to define that and make that clear. Okay, cool. Well, let's move on to the sort of main topic, which is standardization. As I mentioned, it's been talked about a bit on the show with various people, but let's go back to basics. What is standardization and why is it important?
So standardization for someone who comes from the medical side of things and pharmaceutical production is a absolute must under all circumstances. That's why clinical trials are being done because you want to have a predictable outcome under various circumstances, which is well tried and tested. And we all know that And typically, a pharmaceutical industry takes a single molecule approach to this and say, listen, I need to isolate it, and therefore then I can actually see cause and effect. And I believe, and people who are much more experienced in this, I think would join the fray. I think that cannabis, as such as a whole plant medicine, is not very well suited to that approach. Having said that, I'm saying the clinical trial approach with a single molecule. Having said that, you still need to have the standardization. So when the Canadian industry started, well, a little bit over 10 years ago, I would say, at that point in time, people, there was no extract form. People were consuming flowers. And for a doctor to prescribe flowers as a usage form, when he doesn't know at which doses, how does it individually affect things, where one batch is different from the other, it's just a no-go. So there were some early visionaries, like Erkelins from Bedrocan or Ken Clement from Abcan, who took this very seriously and were trying to standardize the flower, the genetic level, at an environmental level, and saying it needs to be the same light cycle, needs to be the same temperature, etc., to come up with a herbal plant, a herbal medicine. Cannabis is not the only one, poppy the same, and other plant-based medicines as well, which just on every batch would be the same. And so when you take a medical, in the strict sense of the word, approach to the medical cannabis industry, then I think this is inevitable. So you need to get that done, and it is very complex to standardize a plant. And I'm sure Erkelenz must have told you about this, how long it took him to do this and get the seeds and the genetics right, and Ken Clemens from AppCan and others, I think, have been working on this for a long period of time. Where we are coming from is that we think that's a very valid approach. In parallel, though, there's another way of getting to the standardization is through the extracts. Extracts allow you to have more variability on the plant side, and then you standardize through the extraction process, either by isolating compounds and putting them back together, or fundamentally just have a standardized extract in terms of its components, which is more simple to do. And it would be, again, standard pharmaceutical approach at large. I mean, in the pharmaceutical industry, I think the majority of people, when they try to do standardization, will go through that route. They typically will isolate things and then perhaps put them back together at the back end, and you can do this very precisely. Trying to standardize the upstream, so the actual plant itself, is a complicated process.
Yeah, that's certainly what we've been learning over the last few weeks. It's just because of the huge amount of variability and the number of factors involved. So if you're going to take it a step back, that process of getting an extract from the plant material, are you able to distill it so that the same sort of constituent parts exist in the distillate, if that's the right term?
To a certain extent, but not fully. So there is still a batch-to-batch variability, of course, when you produce the extract, if your starter material has variation. So you need to have some form of standardization on the plant side is necessary no matter what.
Yeah.
So that you need to work on. Whether you reduce that variation to 1%, that is becoming a really difficult challenge. If you have 1% of variation on the plant level, then I think it's much easier ultimately to standardize your extract around a certain component. You can dilute it, you add back isolated compounds if you needed to. So that process on its own is less onerous than playing with the genetics. Having said that, it's not one thing is better than the other. So it ultimately leads back to in which delivery form you want to take your medicine. If the delivery format is, there's a lot to be said for it, it's either inhaled or smoked, because you want a fast onset, you want to ensure you have full spectrum, and fundamentally you are taking the plant as a whole, then I think standardizing the plant makes a lot of sense, and that's what the Bedrocans and other people of the world are doing, and they're doing it very well. If you are looking at a slower onset, a longer duration, very often for chronic pain, for example, longer duration, then you will see lots of people using extracts. For many reasons, I'll walk you through of when one patient would do one versus the other. So you have the standardization needs to take place both at the plant level and at the extract level. It just depends on the consumption, call it delivery method at the back end.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things you're talking about is effectively if you standardize the input, and let's call the input the plant material, then it makes the rest of the job slightly easier because there's less variability further down the track.
And you need to do that no matter what. So that's what I said before. That needs to happen no matter what, and that's genetics and tissue culture and cloning, which I think everyone in the industry at this point in time who are serious players and want to serve the medical market, they are doing anyway. Pretty well tried and tested. The question is how much variability you want to allow. And when you're dealing with pharmaceutical product, the variability is minimal. It's minimal. That therefore makes, I think, the job to do this harder than if you go through a different route. And ultimately, I would think 10 years from now, I think the likely way this may evolve if and when I think medical cannabis becomes a pharmaceutical product form, that you isolate compounds and then you add them back together again. That would be, again, that's a typical pharmaceutical route. So you create the entourage effect after having dismantled the car, you kind of build it back together again.
Yeah.
And that allows you to build like precision products. And some of my colleagues in Israel are already working on this, and I think they have this on their mind. I don't know how long it will take till the industry goes down that route, but I think we will be ending up there. This will be a significant component, doing isolated compounds and putting them back together at the back end.
Yeah, which makes sense because you've got the ultimate control in that scenario, because you can tweak the ratios to precisely what you need. Okay, so you kind of mentioned it, there's some use cases where flower is preferable to extracts and then vice versa. Would you briefly sort of take us through those?
So if you go back to the beginnings of the legalized medical cannabis industry, so 10 years ago plus, there was really no other product around than flower. So there was really no extracts. People would do at home tea preparations or something like this, but ultimately the product which was being recommended, not prescribed, would have been a flower at this point in time. So, and therefore, if you look at usage patterns internationally today in the medical cannabis market, there's good research on it, for example, from Canada. You have about 80% of users using it in terms of smokable flower. Then they do express that they actually would prefer to vaporize it, not smoke it, as the second. And then you have a really small component, 10% perhaps or 15%, who would use an extract, because a pharmaceutical grade extract mostly is not available in these markets. And then they would use an extract so edible or just some concentrates, again, which is completely outside of the pharmaceutical route, right? Like a dab rig and a doctor that don't typically go particularly well together. So that's not I think where this is heading. Now, the interesting piece is that, for example, in Australia, the extracts are the majority of the delivery format. And why that is, I haven't entirely got my mind around it, but there wasn't kind of a big illegal grow industry or a legal grow industry, it doesn't matter to me. There wasn't like lots of cultivation already existing anyway, like in California and other places. And so you see really this to be diametrically opposed to where Canada is. So in Canada still, and from the recreational market, we're shifting towards extracts at this point in time, but medical users are still using a lot of flower over there. Same is true in Germany. Germany, we have like 70% of the market consumes in terms of flower. And you would say, why in Germany would that be? Well, again, it's the same answer. There are really no extracts available. That's what we're doing and what we're developing with our German partners. There are 3 companies who are doing this, but historically it has been a very minor segment of the market. You see, therefore, usage forms to differ quite a lot by jurisdiction. And I think it's fundamentally driven by the regulatory framework. Where you have a pharmaceutical regulatory framework, I think you automatically are moving closer to the extract-based situations. Where you have a more, call it medical, semi-recreational, so a very liberal interpretation of what medical cannabis is, you will see still a lot of flower being used.
Yeah, and I guess in part that's sort of legacy and maybe just a lack of maturity of the market, as this moves on, people start to understand the differences in these things, whereas flower is just the thing that everyone's associated with cannabis forever. Is that part of the reason?
I think in part, yeah. I think that's correct, but it has also to do, right, with, think about the user experience, right? I mean, if you fundamentally consume medical cannabis to, let's say, for stress and anxiety relief, and you take it before you go to bed, the need for it to be hyper-precise in dosage, in a hyper-precise dosage form and batch standardization for, I would call a minor, modern times ailment, stress, anxiety, etc., it's not that fundamental, right? So a little variation, I think, isn't that big of an issue. Now, if you start treating serious conditions, which is, I think, what's happening in Europe at large, where medical cannabis is really limited to do this, pain reduction, epilepsy, MS, etc., there you don't have that flexibility. So there it actually needs to be very precise. So it is, I think, driven by the regulatory framework on what people are using it for, really, what makes a difference here.
Yeah. And you mentioned Israel before. Obviously, they are probably one of the more leading medical jurisdictions. What's the sort of profile of the uses in Israel?
I don't really know all that well, but I think in majority it's still flower. But all of the guys, the high-level, GMP level extractors already existing in Israel, and we're watching them carefully. We have conversations with partners over there. I think they're doing really interesting things, and I would think that the flower to extract ratio will for true medical use. So when true medical use of what I spoke of before, I think it will always shift towards the extracts in the long term.
Yeah. I mean, from my point of view, that makes a lot of sense. I think flower is obviously something that people understand who've probably taken it, have had to take it illegally and or recreationally. Yeah. So they're very familiar with that. But if you're talking about growing this market and expanding the the patient base, right, to people that have had no interaction with cannabis before, just from a, what makes sense approach, tinctures, extracts, things like this are much more familiar to them, I would assume.
No, very much so. And I mean, there is an ability to also standardize your smokable, inhalable medical cannabis, and the Israelis developed a device to do so. There's some other devices out there which are fundamentally your high technology precision devices who take a highly standardized input material, but also then make sure that the delivery is standardized. Because just imagine you have a highly standardized piece of flower, but then the way you inhale it, how long you keep it in your lungs, of how strong you inhale it, again introduces a whole set of variabilities. And producing inhaler devices to get medications in your bloodstream always has been a very challenging thing in the pharmaceutical industry for precisely that reason. Because one guy inhales it very strongly, and otherwise he doesn't, and then half of it goes out. And so it's quite challenging from that end. But I think for the flower to be, because that's what we're talking about, to increase the patient base, and I would do it the other way around, increase the acceptability to the physicians of it, you actually need to standardize the plant, the genetics, and the delivery method. So, and there is where the medical inhalers come and the medical devices come into place, right? There's no much sense that if you roll yourself a joint with Petrocan flour, you still can get completely different dosage outcomes. But I think that's where some people are working on, as you know, and I think it's a very promising avenue because it would allow, of course, for the doctors to use the flower with more comfort as a prescription tool. And I think when these devices are regulated, I think it will change the dynamics. And at that point in time, I think then who knows how the share of flower and the total market will play out. It may very well be that point in time becomes acceptable. That is I find it speculative. I really wouldn't know how it plays out.
Yeah.
There's so many
useful.
Things.
Yeah,
There's so many things in our industry. Pretending that you have the crystal ball, always bad idea.
Yeah. But very useful that you pointed out the impact on physicians in this ecosystem, because it's also very important that they buy into it and they understand it and it's something they're comfortable with prescribing. So yeah, really useful to make that note. So I guess, we've kind of quite a bit around the extracts and standardization. What sort of factors do you think will accelerate the move towards extracts?
I think the acceleration of extracts fundamentally will come with the emergence of additional pharmaceutical-oriented medical cannabis markets. Because I think in these markets, that is ultimately what will give greater comfort to the doctor to prescribe them. Now, having said that, on that argument, you would say, why in Germany you have 70% of flowers being prescribed and only 30% of extract? It's a supply issue, I think, in my mind, because the German medical community, I think, is very conservative and traditional on this, and the only extract which has been available and successful, very successful, I think was an extract which is a pure THC. It's pure THC, it's not a full spectrum extract. It's dronabinol. It's dronabinol. And that fits closer with a single molecule idea, and therefore is easier for a doctor to accept. And Bionorica, they saw this probably 15 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, when they introduced this. And so that becomes easier for a doctor, I think, to deal with. I think at a point in time where you have a highly standardized metering device, inhaler, and a standardized flower input, I think future will tell of how it goes. But I think the handling of the product is easier. The administration is easier. Think about the portability. Also, if you need to take your medicine somewhere, I mean, it is, I think, easier to do this. But I think future will tell.
Stability as well, I suppose.
Stability. We have some stability. Yes, we have stability issues on both sides. Okay. We have the stability issue on the flower side, which then they're dealing with radiation issues and others, which again is a regulatory problem in many markets. Also, the extracts is quite hard to keep them over 12 months stability without needing to go into cooling chambers. And pharmacists do not like cooling chambers so much. So the stability is an issue on both sides of the thing.
Right. Very interesting. And I suppose on the flip side, what do you think of the challenges to extracts, if you haven't already answered that question?
Well, I don't really see all that many, I must say. Again, as long as you are on a pharmaceutically oriented industry, I think it will move down that track, unless there's a breakthrough device and a standardized flower availability. I think it will go down that track, and it will not just be extracts, right? Ultimately, you'll have other standard pharmaceutical application forms, nasal sprays, sublingual films, ultimately at some point in time a tablet. But where I think people often get confused, given that the definition of what a medical cannabis market looks like is so different in North America from what it looks in Europe, is that they say, why would I ever use my medical cannabis as a nasal spray in some form? Because it's this quasi-recreational use, or call it, it's not a doctor-prescribed situation. But I think where you have a doctor-prescribed situation, you ultimately will go towards a more pharmaceutical product form, I would think. And you always will have some people who will then still smoke a flower because they like it, they know it from before, it is easy, well known, and for minor, so the modern times ailments it works for, I think it's a perfectly fine thing to do.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just as we come towards the end, a personal area of interest for me is around personalization and personalized medicine. It feels from everything we've talked about today that extracts lend themselves better to that than flower, perhaps. Have you got any views on the intersection of this standardization with personalized medicine?
Not so sure whether you couldn't achieve it either way. I think ultimately my view is that the personalization will be driven by some form of artificial intelligence device which tracks the data and the impact. It can be an app, let's make it less sophisticated. It's like, okay, but it's an app which tracks the user patient experience at different dosage levels, and that already exists. Okay, this is nothing particular revolutionary. I've seen it in Canada, something in Australia. So people are building these, and I think that is what ultimately will drive personalization, right? The personalized medicine trend is, do I have large, massive databases available to myself, and not only for my own product, but like across the industry, large enough where I can fundamentally create a match between the patient demographic and his reaction to the different strains. I think we're 5 years out, perhaps 10, maybe not that much. and people are working on it. And I think that is ultimately which will drive the personalization. And I think you could achieve it either way. I think I see no reason why you wouldn't do the same by prescribing different types of flowers, the different THC to CBD ratios, depending on the weight, age of patient, his own endocannabinoid setup. I think that's possible from either end.
Yeah. Interesting. Lots of unmapped outcomes to happen, I suppose. Cool. Well, thank you, Oliver. That's been really, really interesting. And yeah, definitely we could have talked a lot longer. There's actually a few topics we discussed prior to recording that we could talk about. So I'd love to have you on again and we can go into some of those.
Well, thank you very much for having me. That's always a pleasure.
Fantastic. Thank you, Oliver. Thanks for joining me for that. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did enjoy it, please hit subscribe on whichever podcast platform you use. I'd also love a nice 5-star review on iTunes if you have the time. You can also follow the Cannabis Conversation page on LinkedIn and also sign up to my mailing list via cannabis-conversation.com. Until next week, have a good one.